All right, so another theological point of contention that I've had as an Adventist was the true meaning of the book of Daniel 8:14. The commentaries in the Adventist scene and what the Adventist theologians teach and what Adventist Bible teachers teach, for example, Walter Fite, they teach that the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans had nothing to do or have nothing to do with the cleansing of the temple of Daniel 8:14. And of course, they dismiss any Jewish ties to this prophecy, which is very interesting and hilarious and embarrassing because the Bible is a Jewish book. But let's get into it. Daniel 8:14. Daniel is in captivity in Babylon. And in Babylon, we got to understand that the king favored him and other 3 Hebrew boys, and they found themselves in the king's court. But God had a greater purpose, and that is to reveal through Daniel what was going to happen in the rest of the history of the world. Daniel 8:14 says, unto 2,300 evening, the English translation says, evenings and mornings, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Now, the Adventist doctrine of Daniel 8:14 is not based on the translation of the English Standard Version or the ESV. The Adventist belief of 1844 is based on the King James Bible. The King James Bible, it comes from the Catholic Church. It is the worst of all the Bible translations because what it does is it applies Latin thought and Latin interpretations to Jewish text, which changes the essence of what is actually being said. Now, what was being cleansed or what should be cleansed according to Daniel 8:14? Well, it's simply this. After the Babylonian captivity, Ezra leads 50,000 Jews from Babylon, from Iraq. From Iraq, they go back into the Holy Land and the temple is rebuilt. And he also, what you must remember is that Iraq at that time was not ruled by the Babylonians. It was now the Syrians, and hence Cyrus is involved in rebuilding the temple. Now, he does not only reteach them God's laws, because the Jews in captivity had forgotten the law of God, they'd forgotten Torah, they'd forgotten even the Hebrew language. They were speaking Aramaic and they were speaking Akkadian. Akkadian is an Iraqi language. So they had forgotten how to speak Hebrew. So Ezra teaches them Torah, teaches them Hebrew. He rebuilds the temple in conjunction with Cyrus. And of course, with the rebuilding of the temple is the reestablishment of the Beit Din. The Beit Din is a Sanhedrin because you cannot have a temple, a Jewish temple of worship without the Jewish court, which is the Beit Din. So in the Jewish court, you had Ezra, you had Mordechai, and you had the prophet Nehemiah or Nehemiah in that group of elders. And subsequently, in the restoration of the temple, the Beit Din, Torah and Hebrew, was also the selection of biblical material, which books of Jewish tradition would become the Bible. Now let's fast forward to the year 325 B.C.E. or B.C. The Greeks had just lost their leader, who was Alexander the Great. The 3 generals split the Greek territory amongst themselves. One of the generals takes Greece and all the islands in the Mediterranean. Ptolemy takes Egypt, parts of Saudi Arabia, parts of Arcadia or Iraq, and of course the Seleucids take the Holy Land and begin to rule Jerusalem. Now the relationship between Greece and Israel is defined in the Bible lesson of Esau and who? And Jacob and Esau. In Hebrew, it's Esav and Jacob. So Esav is the bad guy because he sells his birthright just because he wants to satisfy his carnal desires. He's mad at his brother for stealing his birthright and wants to murder him, etc., etc. And the descendants of Esau or Esav in the Bible, they're called the Chittim. If you read chapters, I think it's 11 and 12 of Daniel, you come across the word Chittim or Chittim, and basically the Chittim are all the Westerners, Greeks, Romans, anyone who classifies with Western culture or identifies with Western culture. In Bible terms, they're the Chittim. They are the descendants of the Edomites, who are the enemies of Israel. And so the Greeks then ruled the Holy Land until 64 B.C.E, when the Romans come and take over in 64. Between the years 325 and 125, we see a mass action by the Greeks to Hellenize Jewish customs and the Jewish faith, essentially to Hellenize the Bible. Now, the Bible is a result of Jewish tradition. Tradition is language, thought, and script. The Chittim, the Hebrews, came to change the way the Jews think, the way the Jews speak, the way the Jews write. It's called colonization. It's happened to everybody in the world. But some people have gotten the good idea to go back to their roots, while others got carried away with Hellenization. So the Greeks ruled at this time through the Seleucid dynasty under the person of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. He was incredibly ruthless towards Jews. He persecuted the Jews. He decreed that they should not study Torah. Any rabbi who taught the Torah would be killed. And many Jewish rabbis were killed for practicing Judaism, for teaching Judaism. Priests were killed in the temple. And this killing and persecution of the Jewish people makes the 2,300 evenings and mornings as the first prophetic half week of persecution. The second prophetic half week of persecution is in Daniel, the last chapter, and it refers to 1,260 days, which will be the persecution of Jews today, very soon in Jerusalem and the rest of the world, and everyone who believes in the God of Israel and keeps the law, including the Sabbaths. So that will constitute the 1,260 days. It does not mean that Rome ruled for 1,260 years. It is completely false, because William Miller did not have Jewish education, and therefore he was making educated guesses, if you want to call it that, or rather uneducated guesses, because he didn't have Torah. He did not grow up studying Torah. In fact, if you look at William Miller's story, it's not an Adventist story, it's a Baptist story. I got a document from Andrews University archives, which is called The Memoirs of William Miller. And when you read the memoirs of William Miller, you realize that the Baptist church was kicking him out because he made the wrong dates for the coming of Yeshua, not once, but many times. And the Baptist church got embarrassed because of him, and they kicked him out. And when they kicked him out, on his farm, he started a new church, which became the Seventh-day Adventist Church with time. This is a history that's different from what is mainstream Adventist history, and it has historical facts in Adventist archives. You just have to look. Now, going back to the Seleucids, they decided to change the law of God by making the Jews to become non-Jews, to not eat kosher, to not go to mikvahs, ceremonial washing, to do nothing that is Jewish. They even messed with the Sanhedrin. The Greeks decided who sits in the Sanhedrin and who doesn't. They messed with God's system because they wanted to destroy Judaism. The difference between the Greeks and the Romans is that the Romans in Christianity have used Judaism to their own wicked intentions, whereas the Greeks just wanted to destroy Judaism completely out of the face of the earth. Now, in the process of destroying Judaism, the Greeks brought in the statue of Zeus and they put it in the holy place, in the temple. Imagine in the holiest place, there is the ark that has Aaron's staff, two cherubim, two angels. It has copies of the law inside. It's the holiest place where God lives. And the Greeks dare to bring the statue of Zeus and they put it in the holiest place. They don't only stop there, these Greeks. They bring pigs and they sacrifice them in the altar, both inside the temple and outside in the temple, because the most holy place is inside and the holy place is in the outside, in the outer court. And the Greeks brought in prostitutes. And Solomon's court, because the temple is surrounded by a beautiful work of architecture, pillars, tapestry, and tiling work. It's gorgeous, or it was gorgeous, and that's called the Temple of Solomon. And in the Temple of Solomon, usually you would hear rabbis teaching the Torah, or priests teaching divinity and singing and making music and praising Adonai, which is God. And instead of that, the Greeks made it a military barracks. All the Greek soldiers lived in Solomon's court. And, you know, prostitutes, murder, drinking, all those ungodly things that do not belong in the temple or in the temple of the court of the temple, they found themselves there. And they defiled the temple. Hence, in 2,300 evenings and mornings, the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Now let's get to the meaning of the verse. In Hebrew, it doesn't say 2,300 evenings and mornings. Now, before I get into that, out there in Christianity, there's the King James translation, which says 2,300 days. It's a wrong translation. 2,300 evenings and mornings in the English Standard Version or ESV, somewhat correct. It's on the right track. But the real thing is in the Hebrew text. The Hebrew text says in 2,300 evening mornings, then the sanctuary shall be changed, shall be cleansed. Evening mornings is not equal to evenings and mornings. When you look at your watch, it ticks and talks, because tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. After 60 seconds, you get 1 minute. In the creation of the earth, in Genesis chapter 1, the clock says evening, morning, 1 day. That means that for every evening, morning, you get 1 day. So the ratio is 2 to 1. So if 2,300 evening mornings equal the number of days in which that will pass for the sanctuary to be cleansed, then 2,300, we have to divide it by 2. You divide it by 2, you get 1,150 days. You divide those days by 365 days of the year, you get about 3.1 to 3.4 days of the week. Where does the week come from? The week comes from the Jewish teaching of Genesis chapter 1, where the 6,000 millennial day, the 6 years or millennial days are established. It's a lesson that I'll give you some other time. Now, it means in plain language, in 3.5 prophetic days shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And literally 1,250 days passed. Then the sanctuary was what? Was restored. For a period of around 3 to 4 years, there was no temple sacrifices in the temple because the Greeks had stopped it. The Greeks had defiled the temple. There was no Judaism for a number of years. But at the end of those years, the Hasmoneans rose up. The Hasmoneans were a group of priests. And the protagonist of this revolt, his name was Matthias. Now you have to understand something. In Judaism or in the Jewish society, the priests do not fight the wars. The priests are there to work in the community, to do sacrifices in the community and to do sacrifices in the temple. They don't fight wars. It's the common people that enlist in the army and fight the wars. But because the temple was so defiled that it moved the priests into a revolt, so the priests took up swords and they fought the Greeks and kicked them out of the temple. They kicked the Greeks out of Jerusalem. They kicked the Greeks out of major centers of the Holy Land. And then the temple was cleansed, literally a literal cleansing of the temple and a spiritual cleansing of the temple afterwards through the proper sacrifice of animals as instituted in the book of Leviticus. Now, here's a wonderful thing that happens through the cleansing of the temple. A Jewish holiday or a holy day is born out of the cleansing of the temple. It's called Chanukkah today, but classic Judaism, it's called the Festival of Lights. Why is it the Festival of Lights? Now, when the Greeks were busy defiling the temple and the cleansing was going on little by little, all the olive oil that was burning the 7 lamps of the menorah, because remember God said the menorah should never go out in the temple ever. But the oil was contaminated by the Greeks except for 1 carton of oil. There was 1 carton of oil left. And the priests took that carton and they poured it equally on the lampstands, and that menorah burnt for 8 days, right? 8 days. What's so strange about this? This carton of oil, it only lasts for 1 day. It's meant to last for 1 day, but it lasted for 8 days. Now, if the meaning of the menorah, the 7 lampstands are the 7 spirits of God. It is a symbol for Messiah. It is also depicted in the Magen David, what's called the Star of David by Christians. So the Star of David is not evil. It is a transliteration of the menorah because it has the 7 sides or the 7 spirits of who? Of Messiah. Now, Chanukkah is born as a festival of rededication because of the miracle of 1 day's oil burning for 8 days. What is significant about the number 7 in Judaism? It means spiritual perfection. What is significant about the number 8 in Judaism? The number 8 in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, and therefore in Judaism, it means renewal or a new beginning. This is based on the creation week. God created the world in 6 days, but in the 7th day he rested. After the 7th day, the weekly cycle begins. And so the supposed 8th day is the first day. So the number 8 means a renewal of anything. If it's spiritual or physical, in Judaism, 8 is associated with renewal. And so the Festival of Light, which is mentioned in the book of, I think it's John 10:22, where it says, Jesus was in the temple during the Feast of the Dedication or the Feast of Lights. It means that Yeshua or Jesus was attending Chanukkah, what we call Chanukkah today. And Chanukkah, all the key people in Adventist theology seem to push it aside. They don't want to accept Chanukkah because if they accept Daniel 8:14 and Chanukkah as it is in the Bible, both in the Old Testament, in Daniel, and in the New Testament, then Seventh-day Adventism will not have a leg to stand on. That means William Miller and his predictions must be thrown out. And if William Miller and his predictions and teachings are thrown out in favor of the Bible, then the Adventists are afraid that they're going to lose credit. Now, this is very, very foolish because Mrs. White wrote and said, I quote, "If there's no controversy amongst Adventists, then we must know that we still don't have the truth. If we have doctrines that we are not ready to get rid of, while we cannot find biblical truth that supports them, then we are mistaken. We must search," I'm paraphrasing now, "we must search until we find and correct all of these truths." What I'll do is I will send the actual quote from Mrs. White word for word to the producer so that you can see it on the screen. And therefore, if Adventism accepts the Bible truth, then the pride of Seventh-day Adventism is hurt. Seventh-day Adventism has to grovel to Judaism and ask the rabbis to teach them the Bible. Then Adventism loses its tradition and loses its narrative, but it would never lose its faith, because the pioneers of Adventism, James White, Alonzo T. Jones, and even Ellen White, they believed that we are to keep all the 7 feasts of the Lord and everything else that goes with them, whether it's Tu B'Shvat, which is coming up next week, the Jewish festival of planting of the trees, or Chanukkah, which we had in December, or Rosh Hashanah, which we had in September. All these festivals have their findings in the Bible, and Adventist pioneers were aware of this. So what changed in Seventh-day Adventism? In 1888, at the General Conference, the majority Christians who had come from all these churches did not want a faith with a Jewish flavor. They wanted salvation by works and merit, and not a salvation from sin as a favor of God. Because what happens in the Western society, in the Greek mind, in the Roman mind, there is nothing that comes for free. You must work or pay for stuff. So the Jewish message that says salvation is free, it is foolishness to the Western mind, but it is a treasure to the Eastern mind, the African mind, the Asian mind, and the rest of the world, but not the Western mind. And so Adventism changed in 1888. It became something that God did not want it to be. After the 1888 drama, Ellen White was sitting in bed for 2 weeks. She was sick with what we call medically grief. And she was sick with grief. And from this grief, she said to herself, Adventism still does not know the Messiah. And I agree with her. But look what resulted from Mrs. White's agony. The book Steps to Christ was written for Adventists. It was not written for unbelievers. I used to use this book when I was an Adventist missionary as a set book for teaching the nations about Jesus. So she wrote it for the Adventists who still didn't understand who Jesus was. She wrote Thoughts from the Mount of Blessings. She wrote The Desire of Ages. And she wrote a book, I think it was Life Sketches, I'm not sure, the 4th one. But she wrote these books in succession because she needed to teach the Adventists about the Messiah, because they didn't know him, because the Adventists still held on to the churches, to the teachings of the churches that they've come out of. Now, with Mrs. White's writings, you need to understand that she doesn't just write a book and publish it. She writes a lot of writings, and the editor sits there and puts them together and groups them into books and then publishes them. And most of the time when you read Mrs. White's books, I don't think she had much control over what goes in and out of them. Now, this is not about her, but this is testament to the fact that at some stage, Adventism, just like the other churches, has put aside the Bible, Chanukkah, of Daniel 8:14 in favor of their own tradition, of their own Western understanding and their own Western wisdom. Brother Crozier, a brother who formed the contingent of the Adventist brain during those days, he revisited and reviewed the teachings of William Miller. And he found that the cleansing of the sanctuary of the 2,300, what they understood as days back then, actually would come at the end when Messiah returns. Brother Crozier was 70% correct. I say 70% because he was not brought up Jewish. He didn't have Jewish teachings. Therefore, he did not understand the symbols and the numbers involved in Daniel 8:14. But as we know in Bible tradition, the Bible is a cyclical book. It repeats a lot of things. A lot of history repeats itself. Surely, as the temple was cleansed from the Greeks, it shall be cleansed again in the last days. How is the temple cleansed in the last days? In 64 AD, the Romans came and conquered the Greeks and took control of the Holy Land, including Jerusalem and the temple, etc., etc. And when the Romans came, they did what? They defied the land with their feet, because the Romans are Esau, and Esau is associated in Judaism with pagan worship. So Rome went into Israel in 64 AD and never left. Even today, Rome is in Israel, specifically in Jerusalem. So the temple that must be cleansed at the end of the days that the Adventist brother Crosio was referring to is when Messiah comes again as a man who's going to fight the wars of God, who's coming to conquer the 10 nations of Europe who are ruling the world today. He comes to restore Jerusalem to God and restore the Jewish people to God. He comes to cleanse Jerusalem. When Messiah comes, in the same place where the temple stood, today stands an Islamic mosque. The mosque stands on Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah is important because the rock on which Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac was the same place that the temple would be built over the years. So Islam fighting with Judaism for the most holy place. But what you must understand is that Islam is not the religion of Ishmael. Islam was created by the Catholic Church. It is a Christian institution. So Christianity is fighting with Judaism over the holy place, Jerusalem. And therefore Messiah must return, kick the Christians out and destroy Esav in order to exonerate who? The son of David, and restore the Jewish kingship in the order of things, and Yeshua and God become one, and they become king over all the world, ruling from the holy city of Jerusalem. This is basically what the Jewish narrative is all about, and it explains what Daniel 8:14 means, and it explains how the Greeks mistreated the Jews on purpose in order to have intellectual, cultural, spiritual, and physical dominion over the Jewish people.